Today, we're talking about Leo III the Isaurian. He ruled from 717 until 741, and while he had many important accomplishments that are noteworthy and had a big impact on the empire's future, the thing that he's best known for is being the first emperor to enforce the policy of iconoclasm. So let's just delve right in and look at the life, times, and legacy of Leo III. Let's take a look at Leo's early life. Leo was born in or around the year 685, which means that he was born at approximately the same time that Justinian II ascended to the throne. His name was actually Conon until he became emperor, and he was from a Roman town called Germanica beyond the Taurus Mountains. And because of that, he actually was not an Isaurian, despite that being his name. I guess it is possible that at one point he had ancestors who came from Isauria and were resettled at this town of Germanica, but we simply don't know that for certain, as the sources for Leo's early life are a bit sketchy, as you might have gathered from the fact that we don't know the exact year of his birth, and 685 is more or less an estimate. Justinian II had a policy of resettling towns and populations in order to ensure greater loyalty. So when Conon was still a child, his town was relocated to a location near Mesembria in Thrace. So this must have been before 695, when Justinian II was removed from office. It looks like, however, that young Conon was someone who had a lot of connections and that he was well educated. Because of the fact that he grew up partly in the east, it's probable that he knew Arabic. We know that later he displays great diplomatic skills when he's dealing with Easterners, so it kind of makes sense that he had learned Arabic and was familiar with a lot of the cultural assumptions of that region, and that really enabled him to understand how people there thought. While a lot of scholars assume that Leo III was kind of a rough soldier type, I happen to disagree. If we look at the complexity of his actions at various points, it's clear that he was someone who was very calculating, and it's likely that he actually came from a wealthy family, since he had a fairly sizable herd when he was a young man in 705, as we'll see later. So I think that he actually came from a wealthier background than most people assume, and that his formal education was probably quite good. Also, the name Conon is actually a Greek name, so I know John Julius Norwick said something about Leo may have spoken Arabic better than Greek, but I really doubt that, given the fact that his name was a Greek name. It appears that Conon was an ambitious young man, and that further reinforces my belief that he was someone who was well educated and from a prominent family. In 705, at the age of about 20, young Conon rode out and met Justinian II, as Justinian was making his bid to reclaim the throne. Justinian II, if you'll recall, was marching with his Bulgar allies, and they were about to attack Constantinople and overthrow Tiberius II. Now, young Conon offered Justinian 500 sheep and his support, and Justinian accepted it. And this made a strong impression on the former and would-be emperor, who duly appointed young Conon to his bodyguard, and after that, young Conon was in imperial service, and he would continue in the service of the empire until his death, although he would be a slightly higher rank when he died than when he first entered under Justinian II. Conon first achieved public fame when Justinian II sent him to the east as his ambassador at large, and Conon's job was to meet with the various peoples of the region, the Armenians, the Alans, and others, in order to construct a coalition to help the Byzantines defend their frontier against the Umayyad Caliphate. There were other times when these groups would be potentially at odds with Byzantium, and at that time it would be Conon's job to convince them to fight one another rather than messing with Byzantium. And it looks like he was pretty successful in this job, and that he was an adept diplomat, which is kind of interesting when we think about how autocratic he was later in his reign. In 711, Conan's old mentor Justinian II was overthrown, and that inaugurated another period of civil wars. By 715, there was yet another emperor who had replaced Justinian's usurper named Anastasius II, and he appointed Conon to serve as Strategos of Anatolikon, which is one of the most important of the themes at this time, since it was right on the border and had one of the largest thematic armies. So despite the fact that his original mentor and patron was dead, Conon kept getting promoted, and he was now in favor with the Emperor Anastasius II. So this meant that he now held a pivotal command, and he was one of the most powerful men in the empire, a position that he put to good use. Conon didn't have long to settle into his new command before he was faced with a great challenge. In early 716, two large Arab forces under the Caliph's brother Maslama and General Suleiman invaded Anatolikon. I'm not really sure exactly what Maslama's army was aiming to do, but Suleiman was tasked with capturing Amorium, which was the thematic capital. Unfortunately, we don't know very many details of this invasion. The account of it comes from Theophanes the Confessor, and he is very biased against all things Leo III and all things Iconoclast. But it does seem that in some way, after an entire year's campaigning where Suleiman was unable to capture Amorium, that Leo convinced the two generals to depart, or else maybe they just ran out of supplies and had to go home. It's not exactly clear how and why the campaign terminated, but it is clear that there was really no decision that had been made and that there were no decisive engagements during this invasion. Whenever you have primary source accounts that are at best ambiguous and at worst almost incomprehensible, you get lots of weird interpretations from modern scholars. And John Julius Norwick has one of the Defense of Anatolikon, which pretty much qualifies as a conspiracy theory. So Norwick's idea is that Leo actually promised to be a friend to the Arabs, and that he played the two commanders masterfully, that he made them a lot of false promises and induced them to invade and attack the capital a year later. So in Norwick's mind, it makes sense to want your enemies to attack your capital city. It's kind of a bit of a stretch. His evidence that he wants to use is that when Suleiman and his men were outside of Amorium, they shouted, "Hail the Emperor," and in Theophanes' account they say Leo, but at this time it would actually be Conon, since he had not taken the name Leo quite yet. The problem, though, is that the sources, and in this case the source, Theophanes the Confessor, is hostile to Leo because Leo was an iconoclast. And he would want to cast any level of aspersion or doubt on Leo that he could, and having him appear to be in any way in league with the Arabs would be one way to do that. However, another good reason why Suleiman might have had his men shout this is not because they had reached an agreement, but rather simply because he wanted to spread dissension with that hail. Because whenever a general was hailed by troops, and whenever there was talk of him becoming an emperor, this would make the sitting emperor nervous, and it could cause a civil war. In fact, this leads to the execution and dismissal of generals quite a bit. So if you're a general and your troops hail you, then regardless of your own ambitions, a lot of times your best bet is to just seize the throne. That might be the best way to secure your own life. That had been a problem throughout Roman history, by the way. So that could have been what Suleiman was trying to do, and in fact, it may be the opposite. Maybe the rise to power of Leo III was actually the master plan of Suleiman. And maybe the Arabs were actually taking advantage of the civil war that they helped to foment by giving this hail. At any rate, it's hard to really say, and the evidence is a bit ambiguous, but it is more or less completely open to interpretation on this point. At some point during 716, while he wasn't too tied down fighting the two Arab armies in his territory, Conon found the time to make an alliance with Artabasdes, the Strategos of the Armeniacan theme, and the two of them formed an alliance. Artabasdes was induced to agree to this because Conon offered him his daughter's hand in marriage and a high position of power in the new government. So the two strategoi marched together, and they managed to win a victory over imperial forces under Prince Theodosius at Nicomedia. By this time, a new emperor named Theodosius III had come to the throne, and he was fairly unhappy with the fact that he had been elevated to the status of emperor against his will. So, what ends up happening is that there are negotiations for a month or two, and the gist of these negotiations is that Theodosius III is fine with leaving office so long as his safety and the safety of his son are guaranteed. Leo agrees to those terms, and the two Theodosii retire to become priest. The son actually becomes a bishop at one point. And that's the end of that civil war, and also the end of the 20 Years' Anarchy, which began with Justinian II's accession. Justinian was usurped by Leontius, who was then usurped by Tiberius II, who was then overthrown by the returning Justinian II, who was then overthrown by Philippicus, who was overthrown by Anastasius II, who was overthrown by Tiberius III, who was overthrown by the new emperor, Leo III, who is now renamed Leo III and crowned on March 25th, 717. Now stability is finally back, and Leo's dynasty will last for a little while, so this is a new era. So in 717, Conon had become Leo, and he presided over the Byzantine Empire. So what did that empire consist of in 717? Well, thankfully we have a map that someone made, which shows what the empire held at that time. The exarchate that existed in Italy was relatively strong, even if it was divided, but the Byzantines had ships, so it was defensible. They still held Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. The hold on the Balkans and in Greece was a bit tenuous, and the process of really reconquering that region was in its early stages. In Anatolia, the Byzantines controlled a lot of land, but a lot of it was under constant threat, and even though they held a lot of land leading up to the division between Asia and Europe at the Hellespont, the fact is that Arab fleets were still able to penetrate to Constantinople, and that these defenses were by no means impenetrable. So the empire is still vulnerable, and a lot of things that were true for Heraclius, Constans II, Constantine IV, Justinian II, and that whole slew of usurpers I just named are still true for Leo III going into 717, and he can expect quite a bit of danger should anyone manage to reach the capital. It would appear that Leo had unfinished business with Muslima and Suleiman. In the summer of 717, another massive Arab invasion occurred, and this time the commanding duo was attacking by land and sea, and their target was Constantinople, where their old enemy Leo was now emperor. However, Leo apparently saw this invasion coming from a mile away, or maybe hundreds of miles away, and he and his capital city were well prepared in terms of provisions and planning. So the Arabs threw a massive fleet into this conflict. Supposedly this fleet consisted of over 1,000 ships, and the army was also pretty large, and it landed in Europe and began to besiege the city. However, things quickly went south for the Arab invaders. The basic calculus of naval warfare that Greek fire had created was still the same. It was really impossible for the Arabs to really mount a seaborne assault of the city because Greek fire was too dangerous for their wooden vessels. Now, granted, you can kind of negate the effects of fire weapons by using vinegar-soaked tarps and things, but because the Greek fire sticks to things kind of like napalm, it's not all that effective, and the Arabs were not really able to get close enough. It also looks like, from incidental details that we'll talk about later, that the Arab fleet also wasn't able to find a good harbor, and that their ships became waterlogged over the course of the siege. One thing that happened that was unexpected was that the winter of 717 to 718 was unexpectedly brutal. And this winter led to cold casualties, famine, disease, and cannibalism in the Arab camp. The report is that not only did Arab soldiers eat their dead brethren, but they would mix the human flesh with cakes made out of human shit. So conditions in the camp got pretty dire. Also, because the ground was frozen and there was deep snow, the only way that they could dispose of corpses when people died from famine or disease was to dump them into the water. So, it's about as hellish as it could get. In the early spring of 718, Arab hopes revived when a second major fleet from Egypt arrived, but most of the rowers in that fleet were Christian galley slaves, and they defected in large numbers to the Byzantines, which meant that now this new fleet was undermanned. Norwick and others think that Leo engineered this desertion. However, unless they brought major supplies with them, it's also probable that they looked around, they saw that the Arabs were cruelly losing, and they knew that there might not be enough food for them in the camps, since what food they had was going to go to Arabs and Muslims first, so they probably just said fuck it and deserted. I mean, that would be my guess. Anyway, that same spring, but a little bit later, Leo had made an alliance with the Bulgars, and they arrived, and they managed to rout the Arabs and inflicted 20,000 losses on this really weakened army that, was hungry and a little bit disease-riddled. The defeat there was severe enough that the two commanders decided to call it quits. Maslama led his battered army all the way back to Syria, so he crossed back over into Asia Minor and marched through Byzantine territory back to his own lands, which suggests to me that he still had a fairly sizable force since he wasn't intercepted and destroyed. Of the Arab fleet, and I assume that this refers to the first fleet, not the second fleet, only 5 out of the original armada were able to return to their home ports because so many of them were unseaworthy, and there was also a big storm that blew up as they were on their way home. This was a decisive victory, and never again would the caliphate, whether Umayyad or Abbasid, lay siege to Constantinople. So that meant that Leo III, who was only about maybe 32 or 33 years old, was now a historical figure, and he had won one of the greatest victories and one of the most lasting victories in Byzantine history. While Theodosius III would never rise up again and was content being a civilian, his predecessor, the usurper Anastasius II, was not content to live in retirement. Now, Anastasius II, if you'll recall, had ruled from 713 to 715 until he had been overthrown by the unwilling Theodosius III and then allowed to retire to a monastery in Thessalonica. Apparently, for him, going from imperial life to living as a monk was not very suitable. So he rose up in 719 with help from the Bulgars, who apparently now had changed their minds about Leo, and he marched with his supporters on Constantinople, but he was intercepted and defeated by Leo, and then he was captured and executed. So, despite the fact that Leo had become a national hero by defending the capital, this sort of general sense of anarchy and the throne being up for grabs was still in the air. So this sort of shows you the extent of the crisis that Leo inherited. And presumably once he put down Anastasius, this showed that he was there to stay and that he was not another transient passing in the night, that he was going to be emperor until death did him part. In addition to being a diplomat and soldier, Leo III was also a reformer and a masterful administrator. So in 726, Leo issued the Ekloga, and this is a series of legal changes to imperial law, which mostly made Byzantium a better place. The key feature of the Ekloga is that serfs are elevated to freeholding peasants, and the themes that we think of in better recorded times will be themes where the average citizen there is a freeholding peasant rather than a large landowner. So this will be a fairly major change to the legal status of citizens and to the nature of citizenship in the empire. To sugarcoat this major blow to major landowners, Leo did end an unpopular practice of requiring tax payment ahead of time, which was something that elite landowners had been complaining about for a while. He also made some judicial reforms, including making execution the preferred method of dealing with ex-emperors rather than mutilation. Originally, mutilation had been implemented because it was seen as more merciful, but Leo III had worked for a guy who had been mutilated and come back anyway, so he knew that it didn't work and that it just really inconvenienced someone. I imagine Justinian II probably had a little bit of labored breathing because of his mutilation, and I imagine some of them went worse than others. Mutilation would come back later, by the way, but it'll be gone for a while. Now, this legislation was not popular with the clergy and nobles, supposedly, although our source for this is Theophanes the Confessor in terms of the reception for these laws. And I imagine the noble part he's right about, because, why would they want to lose their control over the locals? As for it being unpopular with the clergy, I don't really know why they would have a strong opinion on this, given that this doesn't affect them very much. But presumably this would have been wildly popular with the people. This would be the equivalent of when the Russian czars freed the serfs. This is something that the vast majority of the people in the empire would have benefited from and would have applauded. Scholarly debates are largely predicated upon what the sources do and don't tell us. And because Theophanes the Confessor is our main source for Leo III's reign, and Theophanes was deeply religious, most of what we know about Leo is about his involvement in the iconoclast controversy. Therefore, scholars, when they think of Leo III, they think of iconoclasm first and foremost, and a lot of scholars probably aren't even aware of things like the Ekloga or Leo's involvement in a lot of the other things I've talked about, because iconoclasm casts such a long shadow over everything else he did, at least in the scholarship and in a lot of the sources, in terms of the amount of coverage that it gets. So before we get into iconoclasm as a whole, I would first like to take a look at what Leo's religious views might have actually been. And again, this is speculative, but because so much ink has been spilt on it, I feel like we have to talk about it in detail, even though I actually find this issue less interesting than the other stuff that we've already talked about. At any rate, because Leo is from the eastern provinces, some older generations of scholars thought that he may have been heavily influenced by religions like Islam and Judaism, which were anti-image, and that this ultimately influenced his views, and that he was not a big fan of icons from an early age. However, in 717 and 718, when the siege of Constantinople was going on, Leo freely allowed the use of icons as morale boosters. So he didn't have a great objection to using them then. Now you could argue that was a time of emergency, so maybe that would be an extenuating circumstance, but who knows? Later, when Leo passed the Ekloga, and he did other things, the way he implemented iconoclasm being the chief example, Leo made it clear that he was someone who was totally comfortable acting by fiat, and that he didn't give a damn what other people thought of what he did. He thought he knew best, and everyone else needed to listen. He clearly saw it as the emperor's duty to set people straight and tell people what's what. Now, another assumption that some scholars have made about Leo and his religious views is that he's not as committed to issues of doctrine and Christology as most Byzantine rulers. However, once he made up his mind, his view was that he was right, and that he was going to enforce his correctness and make sure that other people recognized and adhered to it. So what are the origins of the iconoclast movement? Well, It appears probable that there were Christians who had issues with icons from an early date. After all, the second commandment could easily be interpreted as being against the use of icons. The main argument that people use for the origin of this is that there were prominent Jews and Muslims who had some influence on Byzantine thinking, and that over time they began to have an effect on the Christians that they interacted with. There's especially a story about a Jewish necromancer who healed the caliph and then recommended that the caliph destroy all the icons in Christian churches in his territory. So there were people actively advocating and trying to persuade Christians that icons were bad. There were also setbacks by that the Byzantines suffered at the hands of the Arabs from the 7th century into the 8th century, and it's probable that some people might be looking for a religious explanation. Why did we lose the majority of our empire to these people who don't believe in the proper religion? Could we be doing something wrong? Could we be offending God in some way? So they might be looking for an answer that would adhere to that question. Also, one thing that may have inspired the backlash against icons is that the usage of icons was increasing pretty dramatically in the years prior to Leo's accession. Justinian II was the first ruler to put an image of Christ on his coins, and it looks like there were other uses of icons that some people found to be a bit ridiculous. At baptisms, some people were using icons to serve as godparents. So if you were against icons and then these practices began cropping up and the use of icons intensified, you'd probably be deeply offended. There also were some bishops who were deeply anti-icon, and they began to petition the emperor and to give sermons on the issue. And at the early in Leo's reign, there was also a major volcanic eruption at Thera, and because there were no professional geologists at the time, any kind of major natural disaster like this was always interpreted as a sign from God. And apparently, it's possible that Leo interpreted this volcanic eruption as being a sign that God was displeased with icon usage. So those are some possible factors as to why this movement was becoming prominent going into the 720s. So we don't really know a lot about Leo's actual personal convictions or his thought process when it came to icons. And because of source biases, we also don't even know exactly what arguments Iconoclast used. All we can do in the case of Leo is just look at his actions and try to infer what he may have been thinking. So let's look at those actions. In 725, Leo delivered a sermon where he cautioned people to not be so excessive in their use of icons. The next year in 726, he decided to set a personal example by removing a gold icon of Christ from the Chowky Gate to the Imperial Palace, where this was a very prominent spot in public, and it commemorated a lot of the conquest under Justinian. This removal really pissed a lot of people off, and it was shocking to the population of the capital and to a lot of people in the empire as a whole. So actually, the officer who was in charge of removing the icon was murdered by women, and there were protests throughout the city, and there were actually mutinies in the Aegean fleet. So this created a serious backlash, and we'll see that it was actually a few years from this when Leo actually made an imperial decree on the issue of icons. So let's talk about two different ways of viewing the Iconoclast controversy and Leo's decision to ban the icons. So the traditional way of looking at this is that it is a church conflict which pits East against West. The general thought is that bishops and lay people in the East were more favorable to banning icons, not only because of their proximity to Jews and Muslims, but also because there may be a possible link with the theological doctrine of Monophysitism. There we go. where Christ only has a divine nature. Therefore, it would be kind of ridiculous to portray him as a human, since that is not his nature. However, in the Balkans and in Italy, there was no Monophysite tradition, and icon veneration had been a thing that people have been doing for generations. So for them, this is an affront against their personal sensibilities and the way that they live their lives. Newer scholarship, however, tends to favor the idea that the implementation of iconoclasm is mostly a reflection of Leo's personal views and his autocratic style of governance. I don't really know which of these is correct, but I thought that I would just present both of them to you, and you can decide for yourself. So, the trouble that blew up in Constantinople was actually relatively mild. We only have a report of that one official being killed, but in Italy, it was pretty severe. So the Exarchate of Ravenna as a whole broke out into revolt in 727, and Pope Gregory II, who was a supporter of icons, was someone encouraging that discontent and these revolts. So the Exarch himself was killed, and all of the various governors in Byzantine-held lands were routed, and their rebelling garrisons, who were all local recruits, decided to choose their own leaders, and some of those leaders declared independence. For the next few years, Leo spent his time negotiating with the Pope, and the Byzantines were able to reclaim most of the Exarchate in the course of time. But of course, this revolt would have taken a little bit of time to reconcile. At any rate, so you can see that Leo's action had a major consequence. And at this point, all he did was remove a single icon in Constantinople. He actually did not ban icons yet. That won't be a thing that he'll do until 730. So let's look at one of the areas that broke away during this time and how that had a big impact on history. So one of the areas that revolted from the Byzantines at this time was Venice. And unlike most of the other areas in Italy, it would not revert to Byzantine control. It now became an independent power, or maybe semi-independent power might be a slightly more accurate label. So the leader Ursus, also called Orso, was confirmed by Constantinople as being the Dux of Venice. He was the guy who had been chosen by the local garrison to take over from the defeated governor. Now, in the course of time, Ursus would be recognized as the founder of the Venetian Republic, and the title Dux, the Roman title for duke, would evolve into the Italian term Doge. So that is the origin of the Republic of Venice and their use of the term Doge to describe their chief magistrate. It's also the name of my girlfriend's dog. So despite 4 years of very strident resistance to his idea of banning icons, Leo III moved forward, and in 730 he decided to order a general ban on icons and had them destroyed. Now, if you tried to preserve icons, you were considered by Leo to be in violation of imperial fiat and of true religion, so there would be a punishment involved. However, I'm not entirely sure what that punishment is. Also, there were monks who decided that they needed to preserve their icons, and some of them fled to Italy. Now, a distinction needs to be made. This was not a general persecution as of yet. The punishment was not meted out for iconodule beliefs, and for some reason, instead of calling them iconophiles, the accepted term is iconodule. The laws are simply against the icons themselves and the practice of using icons. So belief was actually spared. So that might indicate that Leo's idea was that the icons are cool, but that they are an affront to God, and that getting rid of them will help the Byzantine Empire expand and prosper. But again, I'm just kind of speculating there. I don't really know exactly what he was thinking when he did this. It seems like a pretty bold move and something that could get him another potential usurper. So after the official imperial edict banning icons, Pope Gregory II began writing letters to Leo and denounced his policy. And Leo III decided to make a throwback to Constans II, and he dispatched a ship full of men who were ordered to arrest the Pope and bring him back to Constantinople. But their ship was unable to cross the Adriatic due to some issues, and by the time that a Byzantine force was able to land in Italy, Gregory II was dead. So that plan didn't really work out, and he wasn't able to pull a Constans II at the end of the day. When Pope Gregory II died, the Vatican elected Pope Gregory III, and he held not only the same name, but the same views when it came to icons. So the new pope also defended icons, and essentially Leo III had gained nothing by his accession. In fact, Gregory III went further than his predecessor. He actually held a council and then ordered excommunication for anyone who destroyed icons. So Leo III gave up on his plan to arrest the Pope, and instead he decided to use his authority to shift various bishoprics in Italy and the Balkans from Rome's control to Constantinople's. And this would start a process of divergence between the Eastern and Western churches, and this was just one of the many steps that ultimately helped bring about the schism that will occur later on. So Gregory III and his council were in approximately 731 or so, and we really don't know what Leo III did during the 730s. We have very little evidence for his activities during that time because Theophanes the Confessor is the major source, and his interest in Leo III is in his Iconoclasm, and then he was eager to get past Leo to his son Constantine V, who was an even bigger iconoclast, so he could rant and rave about Constantine. So because of that, we don't really know much about this big chunk of Leo's reign. We do know that Arab attacks in Asia Minor remained regular, so that was something. And we don't really know what Leo was doing. Was he in the capital? Was he helping out on the eastern frontier? We don't know. So kind of a wasted opportunity by Theophanes, and our understanding of this period is poorer because of his obsession with a single issue and the lack of any other source that would give a better account of this period. The last event in Leo III's reign that we know about is the Battle of Akroinon, which occurred in 740. In this battle, Leo III would command in person, and we can sort of construct a little bit of the activity he may have been engaged in the 730s from what happens here. So it looks like the Arab attacks were becoming more limited in scope because Leo had made an alliance with the Khazars, and the Khazars had been attacking the Arabs from the north and therefore dividing their attention. It looks like in 737 that this arrangement had come to an end when the Arabs had inflicted some pretty major defeats on the Khazars and then decided to refocus on Byzantium. And they launched a two-pronged invasion of Byzantine Asia Minor. So Leo III decided to face one of those prongs in open battle and fought a pitched battle at Akroinon, which, if you look at the map, is not very far south from Memorium. And this battle ended up being decisive. Of the 20,000 Arabs who were in the army, Leo managed to eliminate about 13,000 of them. So pretty decisive victory. And the rest of the campaign was just Arab forces looting in Cappadocia, and then they went home without taking any major cities. So while this wasn't quite as dramatic as his defense of Constantinople, where cannibalism occurred, this is still a major victory and something which greatly enhanced the security of the empire. Despite the fact that Theophanes the Confessor was heavily biased against Leo III, the fact remains that he was a very successful emperor. He managed to end the 20 years of anarchy and bring stability to the empire for the first time since Constantine IV, more or less. His Ekloga were reforms that were really key to Byzantine power, military prowess, and the fully mature thematic system of later days. His victories at Constantinople and Akroinon, when combined with the other reverses that the Arabs were suffering on other frontiers and internal tension that was springing up in the Arab heartland, really helped to improve Byzantium's standing in the world vis-a-vis the Caliphate. Now, the downside to Leo's legacy is that he inaugurated the Iconoclast controversy, and that this will rage on in one form or another until 843, and will, in some ways, lead to at least one usurpation. Now, iconoclasm has another effect of driving a further wedge between the East and the West when it comes to church affairs. But overall, it's really hard to deny that Leo III the Isaurian was one of the greatest of the Byzantine rulers and is someone who was key to their later successes when they reclaimed their apogee, despite the fact that he didn't really add that much territorially. He really strengthened the empire in some really important ways, and no account of Byzantium's comeback is complete without looking at the deeds of Leo III. So next time we'll look at his son, Constantine V. I will see you then and there. Until then, I'm Decisive the Historian. Be sure to check out all of my links and follow me all over the internet. That's all. Good night and good luck.